Good day, everybody. Welcome to CILT's International Business Forum's very first webinar. Today's webinar, actually, we come to you live from virtually every part of the planet, pretty much, with speakers who are going to give you great insights on how digitalization facilitates trade. So keeping in line with the message of our international president, Dr. Razak. This year, we had sustainability, green and sustainable initiatives as one of the themes. And the second theme that is working hand in hand and really is pretty much linking together with sustainability, or the other way about, is digitalization. So today we're going to introduce to you a few speakers. Some of them are not from our CILT family, and some of them are from our CILT professional family. But before we start the session, allow me to pass the mic over to Mr. Finbar Cleary, who is the chairman of the International Business Forum of CILT. Finbar, over to you.
Thank you, Reshma. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I am Finbar Cleary, CILT IBF Chairman and CILT IVP. Just a few short words on IBF, as I know you're all waiting to hear from our 4 international speakers and their presentations. I will share with you just 2 slides. Okay, what is IBF? IBF is the International Business Forum, is a CILT environment created especially to enable cross-border businesses focus, support and activities. IBF is a special interest group within CILT, offering increased support and international connectivity for our corporate and individual members for cross-border businesses development purposes. Our aim is to provide the territories and branch business members increased international connectivity, networking, knowledge sharing and thought leadership focused on business development between them. The ability to connect with the right person at the right time in the right place in a trusted business context. IBF business members will have access to networking opportunities between both virtually and hopefully very soon physical at international and regional and local events. Some of the benefits will be the awareness of events of specific interest and access to materials for their own business development needs, access to unique thought leadership, subject matter experts, share best practice, those solutions in a trusted environment to the many challenges that face our business members today. These are my contact details. If you want to contact me directly, please do, and I'll give you more information and backup. I thank you, everybody, for attending today. Now let us get to the real business of the day. Over to you, Reshma.
Thank you very much, Finbar. And this is an excellent idea. The International Business Forum is something, an initiative, really excellent initiative for members to exchange knowledge. And I think very important for our corporate members, right? Our corporate affiliate members. It's an excellent opportunity to network and collaborate within the CILT International family. That's really nice. So I believe all of you can see all the members on our panel. You can see, of course, our international president is in the room. Yeah, Dr. Razak is here. Dr. Razak will be chairing the session today, and he will give us a summation after we have finished all the 4 speakers today who will present their portions of the program. Now, let's get the program started. So, as our first speaker, to set the tone right, pretty much, because when we talk about digitalization, Industry 4.0, specifically how these initiatives and the gamuts of all the solutions that are out there how does it actually facilitate trade? We will start with our first speaker, and we're really lucky because our first speaker, Mr. Ian Watt, he comes all the way to us. Of course, he's in Scotland right now, aren't you, Ian? You're in Scotland right now? Yes. And he comes all the way from UNCFACT. So this is a UN body that studies and comes up with standards on digitalization. So I'm not going to take the whole presentation by myself. Please allow me to pass the mic to Ian, so Ian can then present what's this whole thing that UN is doing, what is the purpose of it, and how does it actually facilitate trade? Because that's really important. We all are talking about single windows and stuff, right? So let's hear from Ian. Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Reshma. Yes, my journey did start in Scotland, but I'm speaking to you today from Melbourne, Australia. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about an overview of global trade facilitation, what's happening, what are maybe some of the pitfalls and advantages of this whole digitalization thing. I want to talk to you momentarily about UNCFACT and how that is hung together, and then we're moving towards global standards. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk, as I said there, an overview of digitalization and towards global standards. Now, I'm currently a vice chair of the Bureau of UNCFACT, which comes under the UNECE. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. I actually started programming computers in 1969, so I have been 50 years in this trade, 25 years in corporate, 25 years private, and being tangled up in this standard setting thing that I thought very necessary. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. Okay, let's look at the timeline of this digitalization. In 69-70s, when I started writing software, we wrote software that suited the company we worked within. And then at a point in time in the 90s, suddenly they wanted to pass data between these companies. And of course, everything was disparate. They hadn't described an address the same way or a part number the same way or whatever. So there was a standard came about called UNECFACT in about the 1990s. And this was really to digitize existing documents, order, invoice, and whatever. And it could do it relative to medical supplies or fast-moving consumer goods or holiday parts, a holiday. More recently, they've moved closer to actually looking at the semantics of the data that is used in international trade. And that's where we're seeing this thing called the core component library, which I'll go into in much greater detail. And now, of course, as we move forward into 2020 onwards, we're starting to hear about digital blockchain and artificial intelligence, IoT, verifiable credentials, the programmable web, all these things happening in the 2000s forward. So the timeline of what we've been through is the first 40 years of this, 1970s through 2010, we basically attempted to digitize documents. Now we're able to digitalize the process and look at the data in the context of that. When I say data push and data pull here, this is a very important concept. We've been following the 400-year-old process of sending an order to the supplier, sending an invoice back to the buyer. We now are getting to the point when all of us using these apps on our iPhones and everything, we're pulling data from repositories. It's not being pushed at it, we're pulling it. When we go to Amazon, we pull data and we make choices. So there's a big difference happening here. Next slide, please. So what is the work that CEFACT does? Well, it's looking at the e-business trade facilitation supporting software development at the technical level. So my background is a software developer. So I look to CEFACT to say, well, are there some standards that I could make more easy my application to application interfacing? And could that be more standardized so that whole industries can do it more cheaply and more effectively and ultimately achieve a level of interoperability? And that's what we're looking at the moment. We're looking about addressing the end-to-end of the cross-border management, and that is becoming much more important than just shifting a container from one side of the world to the other. We're all of a sudden very interested in where did the grapes come from? Where did the cloth come from? Who was the end consumer for this whole circular economy and fair trade and the sustainable development goals and these other things that we're beginning to become extremely worried about as society? And the other thing we do is CEFACT is make a very big distinction between the sales contract between the buyer and seller of the goods and the services, be they transport, containerization, and so forth. Next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the more recent work that's been done, and this is leading to the digital and sustainable trade facilitation. This is work that's going on, and it's virtually producing blueprints about how countries around the world can start to do things at a government and industry association level. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to present here to the Chartered Institute of Transport and Logistics, because it's bodies like yourselves that will pick up on this work and make it the rubber hit the road. So you can see there the signature at the bottom of there, Olga, the position of this person, and this is the sort of stuff that's coming out. So next slide, please. This here is some recent work over the last couple of years at the UN Economic Commission for Europe level. And if we looked at this business requirement specification, it's actually a very detailed blueprint about how the activity happens between the agriculture and the manufacturing and the transporting and arriving at the other end, and everything from the farm to the consumer. So these blueprints are not only describing process and various other aspects of end-to-end supply chains, but they're also talking about the data that is used within those. So if I went back to my early life 50 years ago of writing software, if I could have a spec like this, and the company, my peer and another company in the same kind of industry had to have the same spec, we would have written software that was much more compatible and much more interoperable. But we didn't have that opportunity, and now the world's trying to correct that. Next slide, please. Now, COVID has reared its head and made our lives very rearranged, and it's particularly interfered with supply chains. And we've learned a lot about supply chains, that they were fairly too rigid maybe for such an event. So there's been some very recent rushed work which has brought things forward very quickly, because we're beginning to hear that COVID has actually made us realize that standards for interoperability and a bit more dynamic about how we can move around and be a bit more flexible are probably going to be needed. Next slide, please. So we've had recent work completed that is to do with reference data models. This is the semantics, the data that is required within a particular industry sector, be the transport and logistics. Smart container is about the ability to have containers on devices that will monitor temperature, vibration, geolocation, and so forth, so that we've got a much better chance of looking after the product during its journey and substantiating the journey it took, and making sure that it took the right journey and wasn't interfered with on its way through. So that's starting to address a lump of the counterfeit products and various other things. CEFACT produces a lot of white papers, and I've been involved in a lot of the blockchain work as to how that might be applied to industry. We're now moving forward into the future, where we're looking at data interchanges across cross-border management, across agencies, and what's happening at the end-to-end track and trace. There's some linkages here that you can use to go and have a look at some of the standards. I'll show you more about that in a minute. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now that we're looking at transport across all of these areas. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next one. Yeah, this spreadsheet, please go back to the spreadsheet. I know you can't read that, but you can see the crosses there. And this is an analysis that says it's looking for how similar things are across things we believe are different, whether it be maritime or air or whatever. There's a lot of commonality in what we need in terms of information. And if we can get that commonality into some standardized semantics, then things will become much more operable. Next slide, please. So what is CEFACT? So CEFACT is a body under the UN. It has about 1,500 experts from around the world. We all donate our time in. It's a pro bono situation. And it's to be there, you need your head of delegation, which in my case comes from Department of Foreign Affairs, to say, yes, you're a qualified person to contribute into this work. Once you're approved, then you start to get involved in project teams. Next slide, please. So twice a year before COVID, we met somewhere in the world. So these places I've been to recently as a vice chair, and I've led teams of people as these deliverables have been produced. There is one of the forums is always in Geneva. That's in the Palais des Nations. And that is also where they run the plenary. That's like the shareholders of the company. The vice chairs and the secretariat present at a plenary to the heads of delegation, which are the member countries of the UN, who actually approve the program of work and sign off on what's been delivered as genuine standards that are useful for society to use. Next slide, please. Just to give we'll flick through these fairly quickly. You can see there in the middle, Economic Commission for Europe. That's where we fit. Next slide, please. You can see that we fit under the trade division. Next slide. You can see the associations that UNCFACT is aligned with. So anybody who says, oh, standards, there's so many of them that we can ignore the lot. In actual fact, these standards bodies all work together under various MOUs and various other things to pull things together. Next slide. So what the UNCFACT is about, you can see where it fits under the UN and UNECE and then the CEFACT with a global remit. Even though it says UN, it is a global remit. So the objectives are simplified, transparent processes, efficient and automated exchange of information between computer systems, recommendations and standards, and it's a PPP between the public sector and the private. So even at the vice chair level, I'm one of 2 independent persons where others come from government departments or whatever. Okay, next slide. Here are the objectives. It's to simplify things. It's global reach, and it's these experts that I mentioned before. And I've just this week been on a number of conference calls working through projects and so forth on some fairly decent deliverables. The outcome is it's a regional, international, and national dimensions that can be applied to these standards. Next slide, please. This gives you an overview of the nature of the work. Rashma talked about single window before. Process driven, we can see standards around process and how things happen there. There's the old UNECFACT from the 1970s, 80s era. It's not only just about moving goods, there's also tourism and natures of things of that nature. There's all those certificates that have to determine that goods are suited for export and suited for import. And then there's the start of the areas around sustainability. Next slide, please. So there's pretty well what it delivers. And one of the things I was talking about there, code lists, common directories, business common libraries, agreed business standards, and international agreed recommendations. I'm going to take a halt here because what I'd like you to be able to do at the end of this presentation is understand where to go find this stuff at CEFACT. And this is the sort of stuff that I'd like you to be able to go and find and think about within the CILT as applicability. Next slide, please. There's a list of recommendations. The recommendations that are like recommendation 4 about setting up a trade facilitation bodies inside countries to be able to bring this knowledge forward to its industry associations of government and start aligning one country with another country in terms of exchange of goods and so forth. So you can see a lot of different recommendations here. Next slide. See some specific ones around single windows. Next one, please. Next slide. This is the structure of the Bureau. There's a chair, and I have 3 areas of accountability: agriculture, supply chain, that's the buy, pay, and procurement, vendor scheduling, and all those sorts of things, and travel and tourism. Why is travel and tourism in my portfolio? Because it's remarkably similar. If you remove the context of shifting people around to shifting goods around, there's an awful lot that's very similar in terms of keeping track of things, justifying who they are or what they are, and so forth. My peer, Hanain, is in the transport logistics, so obviously we work closely together. There's finance and payment, and then there's the cross-border regulatory matters, and then we get down into the more government agency side. And to support all of this, we've got a technology wing which looks at the specifications and technical material and how we go about doing this work. Next slide, please. Now, it's an open development process. So when a project is conceived, it has to have three countries, head of delegation, approved for this project to proceed. You form a team, and they gather the requirements by working with people from around the world in a team of maybe 20 people. One of the ones we're dealing with at the moment that's under my arrangements is multimodal transport, and trying to sort out how we can keep track of things from end to end through the multimodal transport that occurs. There's then a draft development of a specification or a guideline or whatever. It goes out to a public review, and we have to respond to all of that. And when that's done, we can reach a project exit and publication. At project exit, before it goes into international spheres, it has to be approved and signed off at that plenary I mentioned that happens in Geneva once a year. And thereafter, we have to maintain things. And this is a bunch of people doing everything voluntarily. Next slide, please. So the recommendations are submitted to the plenary for approval. The standards go through this whole program of work, and member states participate. Next slide. So a general flow: the Bureau, the plenary, the terms of reference, the program of work, the work that goes on, and how it all hangs together to the final approval. So there's the workflow of how something comes into the CEFACT factory, if you like, and comes out the other end as a useful standard for society. Next slide. Keep going. Right. That's what it does. We mentioned that before. Next slide. Obviously, we look. So now when we start thinking about the international supply chain, you've got all of these: prepare to export, import. Now there's a version change coming about, because prior to preparing to export and subsequent to importing, we're all of a sudden very interested in society about track and trace, end to end, paddock to plate, and so forth. So some of the work we've now got to do at CEFACT is to pick up on society wanting to do those things. And there's already done extensive work on leather and textile traceability, which is looking at making sure that when you buy something and the QR code is scanned, eventually we'll be able to look at the passage of that goods that you've purchased and the countries and the factories and so forth. And you could make a choice as to whether it was worth purchasing this or whether it was actually using slave labor. And of course, you'd leave it on the shelf. Next slide, please. So when we look at a shipment, a movement of the goods, there's some very basic rules around that. And when we look at a consignment, the shifting of the goods, there's also some very basic rules around that. So this has been well sorted out, very high level, very structural understanding of the movement of goods and the information that goes about them. Next slide, please. So now we're starting to get a little bit technical, but basically what this is, for those with you a technical bent, this is the data that is relative to the buying and paying. This is the data that is needed that is relative to the transport of the goods. And you can see that they're related through those lines and so forth. Here is the data that's needed by agencies. And here's the information that's needed by customs. So we've been able to gather all of this data and put it into some form of schema of how things hang together. And this, of course, is extremely high level. But in here, you'd have name and address, you'd have products, you'd have characteristics, you'd have Incoterms and all those sorts of things that apply to the goods. And down here, you're going to have all sorts of things about logistics. And over here, you're going to have all sorts of things about government agencies and taxes and duties and so forth. Next slide, please. Now, this is, think of a dictionary. Let's think of the Oxford Dictionary, for instance. It's got thousands of words in it. And the core component library is the thousands of data elements that's used in international trade. This one is just the subset that is relative to dealing with multimodal transport. So there's a simplification going on for consumer use of this material, more relative to the context within which they do business. Next slide, please. So there's a context of data around the buying and paying, about the moving, about getting across the border. And now we're working on a new one about the sustainable circular economy and all the things that are associated with looking after the planet and looking after fair trade and so forth. Next one, please. We'd all started back early in 73 with a thing called the UN layout key, which was a carbon paper was the technology. 2 or 3 pieces of paper could be typed on and the characters would go through. And the paper was laid out in a particular layout. So the top left hand was company addresses and the bottom right hand was values and so forth. This is the start of a standardized way of communicating information, and Finbar and others who've been in the supply chain freight forwarding thing for some time would know very much about those. Next slide, please. This, for those who have been around in the freight forwarding thing, you'd recognize this as the UN layout key document. Next slide. And that document, of course, needs to have fields filled, which came off code lists, which have been looked after by the UN and others. And that's how we got to the start of the sharing of information that was understandable between companies. Next slide. Now, what we've done more recently, in the last 20 years, we've shifted from paper through XML to some form of equivalent in a digitized manner. Next slide. Those UN layout keys, there was a certain structure, as I mentioned before. There was the cross-sectoral, there was the transactional, and then there was document specific. Next slide. This gives you an idea of the nature of documents that exist in international supply. And we really need information to shift across all of those domains. And we need it to be interoperable between other companies we're working with who are using the same kind of documents in countries. So that's a big picture we're trying to bring some common harmony around. Next slide, please. This is a good slide showing you that certain things exist in the business-to-business world, certain things exist in the business-to-government or government-to-business, and certain things exist in the G2G world. And somehow these have all got to come together. So you've got the CEFACT world, the WCA with their data model, and we have to tie those together. Next slide. This is waiting to look at the invoice level, the house bill and the master bill, which would be very familiar to all of you in the CILT world. Next one, please. This is breaking out these subsets of data from down into messages, down to this one's to do with road transport, and then ultimately getting down to XML or in the future JSON as things are moving forward in technology stance. Next slide. Okay, let's go to next slide, please. Now, this diagram on the left represents the world as it stands. A lot of data flying across a lot of systems and everybody keying stuff in, making mistakes, 30 different documents rekeyed by multiple times between the actors in the supply chain. For some time, there's been the concept of pipelines. Now, this was work done by customs about 10 years ago that suggested that if we could understand the workflow and we had common way of describing the data, then we could put data into a pipeline once from the originator, and that data could be reused appropriately with appropriate authority by other actors in the supply chain to move the trade forward. And this is a major breakthrough in cleaning up data and not having it rekeyed and removing a lot of the mistakes. And this is where we're really starting to concentrate. And this is allowing us to move to the digitalization as distinct to digitization, digitizing documents or digitalization of process and associated data with it in context of process, actors, state transition changes, so forth. Next slide, please. So what are the advantages and the pitfalls? In the first 20 years of my life in software, by the mid-80s, we had written a lot of MRP, material requirements planning software, but companies were still attempting to use that nice new software and force it to try and repeat how they did things in the past, when in actual fact, the software allowed them to do things a wee bit differently. So the advantages are we get this lovely integrated, transparent, interoperable data and benefits derived out of collaboration. But if we don't invest in actual change management of our companies and we don't adhere to the standards, it's all been for nothing. I'll give you an example. I was on a major project in the 80s, and the powers that be in the boardroom had decided that it was a $6 million piece of work, Australian dollars, but they'd totally overlooked the cost and the impact of change management to get the whole business to change, to move the way the software now allowed them to do, which made them much more efficient as a business. That's a 30% increase over what they thought was the cost of just hardware and software, change management. And this is a part that I think CILT should really focus on. Understanding this sufficiently, the standards where we can go, but then really working on how do we energize the change management to actually be successful. Next slide, please. Okay, this is some work. I showed you a pipeline before that came out of customs. This is more recent work out of the world of CEFACT. Slide's a bit busy, but you can see there's some pallets of stuff getting on a truck, getting across a ship and coming off at the other end. This is a blueprint that talks about the data pipeline and talks everything from about the sales contract to the various things that happen in transport to get to the other end. This work has been going on in CEFACT, and these business requirement specifications are an excellent blueprint as to how things can be done similarly across businesses, across industry sectors, and move us towards shared data and taking a lot of cost out of the supply chain. Next slide, please. So dematerialization is breaking down those documents, looking at the process and using the data associated only with the point in the process that's needed. Next slide. This is a figuration really of the sales contract where you've got the actors being the customer and the buyer and the authorities across the agencies and the transport and so forth. And down here is everything around the CILT world where you've got all your transport and logistics and service providers actually shifting those things across. So this should be of great interest to the CILT, but knowing that it's in relationship to what's happening with the buy-pay side. Next slide, please. This one blows out the transport bit a lot more to start looking at booking and way bills and all the other bits and pieces, and there's standards around all of that. Move forward. Next slide. This is a wee bit busy, but for those of us with a technical bent, we'll feel pretty comfortable with this slide. But if you look over here, you've got a core model. It doesn't matter whether you're in transport or by pay side of things. There are always persons and parties and organizations and addresses and locations. So this is applicable to the whole of trade. This is the area relative to buying and selling of things, the certificates, the products, the trade items, the shipments, the configuration, packaging and whatever. Here's all the bits and pieces relative to moving it. And here's all the regulatory bit. So if this is a very big, if you were like working in a very large corporate, let's take Kraft Foods or Nestle, that company somewhere in its IT department would have a model like this about how that business hung data together. Here is a model that operates in the global sense. So that's, and CEFACT's quite good at this kind of stuff. Move the next slide, please. Okay, now we're starting to, this is a bit of the futuristic stuff. We're starting to move to a world whereby, for instance, the container, the BIC code. So this is getting us to the future where data can be discovered at its source and brought into this pipeline for information processing and doing business decisions. Next slide. Okay, don't worry about commit. Next one. Keep going. Okay, CEFACT Deliverables. If you want to find CEFACT Deliverables, here are the links. Here's the spots to go look for. Next slide, please. And you'll start to discover, if you follow this part, you'll see things about cross-industry invoicing. You'll see things about industry quotations. You'll see things about smart containers and transport to logistics. This is where you can go yourselves and find this material. Next slide. That gets down to the detail of it. You can see more in there. Next slide. Okay, that's probably good enough. I've sent you in the direction of being able to find stuff and wander around there and search it yourself. Keep going. And there's contact details. That's it. Next one. Thank you. Thank you, Rashma.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for taking us through. There's a lot of work that has been put into all of these standards. I can imagine I pretty much conduct training on the IMDG code, and I know how much is involved just in developing and updating this code. And the idea here is these standards are to be applied. They're not just for keeping sake, right? So thank you very much. We have a few questions in the Q&A box, but we'll pick it up after all our speakers have completed their session. Now, I'd like to pass the mic over to Mr. Romesh David. And Mr. Romesh David, he's the CEO of the South Asian Gateway Terminals, and he is part of the CILT family. He is a fellow of the Chartered Institute, and he's also the international vice president for South Asia. So he will talk to you about digitalization and collaboration and give you a context of how SAGT had embraced it. So over to you, Romesh.
All right, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone. I think we heard a lot of the base level stuff that actually makes this work in terms of the standards from Ian a little while ago. What I'll try to do is give you a sense for how this happened, you know, taking mainly the pandemic as the onset of COVID in the context of the onset of COVID, and taking what happened in terms of the digitalization that was, if I take Sri Lanka as an example, fairly nascent at that time, and then what it did in terms of helping us to grow. So, you know, in just before up to 2020, there was a proliferation of digitization and information and the flow of information, and it was fairly standard between ports and terminals and shipping lines and freight forwarders. But there were always pockets of stuff that didn't get done, where, you know, either at borders or at agencies, government to government, business to government, and some of that stuff. And more importantly, there was always the interaction at a business to business or business to customer level that had to be physical and that remained physical, despite having the ability to make all these sort of digitally or remotely handled. Now, the pandemic and the onset of COVID really forced the change in all these areas, not only in the transfer of information and documents, but also in the physical meeting and the need to overcome the need to meet physically. And that made a big difference, particularly in areas like Sri Lanka. So what I'd like to do is just look at this at 2 or 3 different levels, and at an organizational level, what it did for us with the onset, the use of digital tools towards a more sort of seamless operation in instances where people couldn't physically meet. And I'll take some examples straight from the company that I work for, which had to adapt very fast. We are a transshipment port. Colombo, the port of Colombo handles about 7.5 million containers. 85% of those containers are transshipment. They come from places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa, and they go to Europe, to the Far East, and to the US. And so the port is extremely dynamic. It is about the 10th best connected port in the world. It's the 23rd largest in terms of size. And SAGT is one of 3 terminals in the port of Colombo. So it is a busy port. It is a crossroads. And it is a port that both shipping lines and other, you know, it's very much a part of the hub and spoke of international container shipping. So there was all of a sudden a need, you know, when we went into a complete lockdown in March of last year, we had to keep the port running and we had to get people in here. Now we can do meetings remotely. We can't run cranes remotely, certainly not yet in Colombo. But in order to do that and to coordinate that, we were able to through the use of the technology, you know, fairly basic stuff like Teams and Zoom and our digital platform. The fact that as a result of being a port, we had a fairly robust digital platform, bring together people who would otherwise not have been able to come and who were not able to come and not be present, through sessions that were online. So we were actually able to operate at an operating level from remotely without having to get together physically. We also had, obviously, work from home became a quick adaptation. But again, in a port, not all can work from home, but functions like the delivery of documentation, financing, HR could work from home. And again, it was this digital information flow and the systems that were available that made that possible. Things like training in a port, for us, on-the-job training, OJT, and recurrent training is imperative. Now, how do we do that when these are usually done through physical pocket meetings, short meetings, group meetings? Now, all of this had to be done, had to be converted through short videos, and short clips that could either be shared in meeting rooms or by WhatsApp with all these operators, because we had to keep them current. Moving on, if we go on to from B2B to a B2C level, how did we, we had to continue the procurement cycles. We had vendors who would deliver goods, we had to order, we had to pay, and those were based mainly around physical payments. Electronic payments were almost unheard of. And we had to then get to a point where, okay, we had to not only place the order electronically, but we also had to ensure that payment was made electronically and things happened seamlessly. More importantly, for 30 years, Sri Lanka has been trying to move to a digital clearance system in terms of particularly import and export cargo clearance. The customs organization, like many customs organizations, had been resisting that, even though there was a core capability in terms of Asikuda and in terms of linkages to Asikuda, that physical interaction was always mandated. Now, within 2 weeks of the advent of COVID, we did, as a port and as between the shipping lines and the terminals, we were able to achieve what had not been possible for the last 30 years. So all of a sudden, an electronic delivery order became okay. An electronic release from a terminal became okay. And all that was needed, rather than a whole host of interactions, was simply a truck driver turning up at the gate with an electronically released, to pick up an electronically released box. Payment for that was made electronically. And that became a huge game changer that happened as a result. So it was very practical and on the ground. Now, this would not have been possible if not for the underlying layer of digitization and digital capability that happened, that was in existence but not used. And something that was probably unthinkable if we looked at maybe 2 years ago, where we have implementations, software implementations, and even equipment handover happening remotely. For instance, we commissioned a spreader, or we commissioned an RTG, a rubber-tired gantry crane, remotely, where you would usually have engineers from China or from Japan or from Sweden coming here. As a result of the digital capability and the connectivity, we now had engineers in Sri Lanka and in the company working remotely and commissioning, linking up remotely and doing handover of $1 million assets, really, without coming over physically. Could we move to the next one, please, Rashmi? And then I think if we take March last year, we had TOC America was about to start, and a conference of 3,000 participants was cancelled with 2 weeks to spare, or less than 2 weeks, with 2 or 3 days. But as time went on, we saw increasingly large, and we just finished, if you look at TOC Europe, the Terminal Operators Conference of Europe, that just finished, had an exhibition that catered to over 2,000 visitors, and it was completely digital. Now, this would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. So this, as a result of the massive strides that we've had in digitization and in remote connectivity, we had this ability to project large business meetings and conferences over a wide audience across the world. We also had at a lower level, at a more sort of nuts and bolts level, we had governments dealing with the population. We saw it across the world, and we saw it even in countries across Asia. India was a prime example of how government used applications and technology in order to track pandemic statistics, go and no-go areas, lockdowns, contact tracing, and so on. And I think lastly, the most sort of one of the most cogent examples was what happened with CILT itself. I mean, we were very dependent on physical meetings. We would meet once a year internationally. We would meet regionally for Africa Forum, for Middle East Forum, for Asia Forum. We would have international conferences in different countries. And since 2020, we have not met once physically. But I would fairly confidently say that the Institute has never been as robust as it is today. We've had, if you take organizations, like WILAC, for instance, we've launched possibly 20 countries over the last 20 months without having any physical interaction. We've launched training initiatives that have never been done before across the globe, completely remotely. So I think it's a great catalyst of what leadership can do. And this is, again, a lot of it was led by the initiative of the CILT leadership, but also from the country initiatives and people getting on board very quickly. So I think even the IBF, we don't really need, this would typically normally have been a launch at a physical international convention. The IBF has come into being now and is operating, never having met physically. So that's yet another example of what happens at a nuts and bolts level. Can we move on, please? The next slide. So in this whole game, from a very company level experience, some of the things that we found out were that people were not equipped at home. Home computers were not necessarily well equipped in terms of privacy, in terms of malware protection, in terms of line speeds. And I think establishing those protocols and having strategies to mitigate that was a fairly difficult governance issue for us. So we had to actually move computers into people's home. We had to contract with telephone companies to give dedicated lines and to give additional bandwidth. We also had to then, as an organization that worked based on physical presence, we also had to then work out, okay, how do we have, when we have 100 people working from home, we don't necessarily have the same set of information and the same capability that, for instance, a data entry company or a data management company would have in terms of monitoring. So there was a huge element of trust that was required. People were needed, to ensure that they would do their complete the work that was required in an environment that was not typical, as an office. We also had a situation where customers were unused to this. So we had to then deploy people to actually go and train customers and say, okay, how do you work with this? How do you use your computer? How do you launch the application? How do you arrange for payment? So these, and then the government had to come in with, although there was an underlying layer of electronic data protection acts, e-signatures, these had never been used. So these had all got to be implemented, and they had to be implemented remotely. So these are some of the pitfalls that some of the issues that were faced, which had to be done, but which got done again as a result of the fact that there was no choice. We can move on, please, Rashma. And lastly, I think very quickly to cover some of what we saw as drawbacks. I mean, in the end, the lack of physical contact and the inability to meet face to face did create some voids. I think we are never going to be in a situation where this will replace, for instance, the breakthrough. The people tend to feed off each other, and ideas tend to feed off each other, and social connections and physical presence. We saw in the last 2 years that was missing. And you can see it immediately as people start to come back to work, there is a new energy. We also saw for the people who did work from home, that many of them don't have home environments that are actually conducive to working. They have to there are makeshift offices. Then we have to ensure, okay, do they have the right ergonomics? Do they have the right people? And in a business that is not entirely driven remotely, those are big challenges to do. But again, the opportunities, I mean, we have seen without any doubt, the whole, the use of systems like Zoom and Teams and WebEx are so ubiquitous. They're so freely available. Connectivity is so much cheaper that, we are going to be in a situation that could never have been conceived 2 years ago. And the ability to keep businesses moving could never have been considered. We did a few other things that we saw in an economy like ours, like Sri Lanka's, where whilst on the one hand, some businesses like the tourism businesses fell off a cliff, and there were huge numbers of people who are unemployed. But very quickly, social media, the use of media like Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp and the ability, the use of smartphones created a lot of entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, whether it was in transport of supermarket goods, whether it was in making and selling items from food to clothing to whatever groceries. That became a huge business for a lot of people who would otherwise not have been entrepreneurs. Education became a huge business. All of a sudden, teachers could reach people who were reliant on who had no experience, but who could then share knowledge with vast numbers of people over this kind of medium, became businesses. So I think these were some of the quantum changes that we saw on the ground. And this is nothing technical, but I hope this was a bit of a snapshot of how of things that changed here. Thank you. And thank you for that, Reshma.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Romesh. That was really good sharing, giving us your experiences and also sharing some of the challenges and the opportunities. And you're right. I mean, I think we meet more now than we ever did before. Like you said, we would only meet like once in a year, and now we're like meeting every other week or probably every week, right? So thank you so much. Now for our third speaker, because we're pretty much running short on time. So let me get our third speaker on. Our third speaker hails all the way from Kazakhstan. And Miss Marina, who is also our WILAT chair for Kazakhstan and also the GVC for Central Asia. She's going to give us an insight of, because Central Asia is a market that not many of us know much about. So she's going to give us an insight about the market there. And she's going to talk about the digitalization journey there as well and the opportunities. So over to you, Marina.
Thank you so much, Reshma. Yes, as Reshma mentioned, Central Asia is not so well known all over the world. We know as Borat country and maybe in country with a lot of camels, somewhere in the steppes between China and Russia. So most of the people, when they have any images, they think that we look like at the top picture. So there is some crazy people which are digging ground with the sticks. So we're a little bit far away from this. When I was doing preparation to this webinar, I was a little bit surprised but how far we went, because I'm a little bit far from this, but let me present Kazakhstan and Central Asia. So Central Asian region is one of the biggest in CIS countries. We represent 5 countries and area is huge. We bigger than Europe, and our digital sales is growing with each year. As you can see here, our cities is quite modern. We have a lot of plants and we have a lot of businesses from private to corporate sectors. In Central Asia space, digital trade is growing, and it's growing very fast. It's grow like 30% per year. And with each year, people are moving from the classical offline stores to e-commerce, which is pretty amazing. As we could see in 2020 during COVID, all of us were escaping from the classical trade to online store because it was safe, and now we're used to it, and we're not so afraid to use our credit cards, and we're not too afraid to use our QR codes. So in Central Asia, it's the same as in all modern world. In Uzbekistan is one of our biggest country. E-commerce revenue is 80%, and in Kazakhstan it's 90%. And our governments are supporting e-commerce. We have special tax policies. So if you're trying to sell something or buy something online, you will have more rights than, for example, offline stores. According to PwC studies, the retail e-commerce segment is growing by 93% during 2020. All digital trade really dependent on speed of internet, as all of us are very well known. Unfortunately, Central Asian countries, quite, as you can see at the graph at the right side, is quite below the average. So Kazakhstan is at 154th place, and Kyrgyzstan at 136th place, and Tajikistan, Turkmenistan are at the level of Afghanistan, which doesn't help them to develop e-commerce so fast as we are, as Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, I'm so sorry. So Central Asian countries needs to develop open and competitive telecommunication market. In some countries, telecommunications companies belong to government and to security. So sometimes speed really depending on how military committees or civil committees are trying to reach the citizens and how they trying to secure and protect the state. So our governments need to develop a digital ecosystem which is friendly to investors, which are friendly to local markets, and which is friendly interface to populations. And we need to attract foreign platforms such as Amazon, eBay, and other companies which should come to our markets and understand that we just not selling just agriculture products or minerals. We also have a huge market, it's craft market. We established in our plants and factories which were ruined during this time when USSR was falling apart. So we are at the stage when we growing, when we developing, and we're trying to be visible a digital market. So Kaspi Bank is our main bank in Kazakhstan. It's one of the biggest fintechs in Europe. In present, so 82% of all sales went from the classical offline stores to mobile applications. So all the people, if you're trying to buy watermelons or something outside, or you're buying equipment in China, you can pay with your QR code. So everything goes through this bank. So market share of Kaspi Bank in Kazakhstan, in Ukraine, and Georgia is over 60%. And with each year it's growing. So turnover is 900 million, and it's doubled compared to 2019. This case is one of the cases which in Harvard students are studying. And with each year, our online and digital trade will be growing. For example, for now, Kaspi Bank budget is almost budget of Kazakhstan for the private and micro sector of economy. We also have YeGov, this is Kazakhstan digital government. Everything which you need to do, from establishing a company, registering your child, you can do digital. online through a computer or mobile app. If you're trying to register your company, you can have your electronic signature, and with this electronic signature, you can sign all the deals, all the documents, all the permission, everything goes through this electronic government, which is one of the first in CIS. So compared to Russia, we are the first place. So as you can see, each person in Kazakhstan reached by this system, and with every year it's growing. So we have, everything is covered from your birth until your death, and everything is online, except you need to go physically to receive your documents. For private and little sectors of businesses, they have special, it's like a cabinet. So through this cabinet, you have access to all your taxes, to all your penalties. You can go through your banks. You can see all your documents. You can see all the documents of your employees. Everything is digitalized. So Ministry of Trade and Ministry of Finance can go through your cabinet because they have access. So it's almost impossible to run from taxes, to be kind of illegal, which in our countries, unfortunately, it's kind of a little bit traditional. So it, yeah, we're Central Asia, so we're trying to trade. And with Kaspi Bank, our government now can trace all your purchase, they can trace all your activities. And with YeGov insurance and medical health sector, they can track your health also. So you don't need this Samsung smartwatch. They can see all the visits to the doctors, and they can trace all the sickness, diseases, whatever you have in your life. Amazon, Alibaba, and AliExpress are coming to our market from 2019. So we're fully covered. We have special, even special sales for Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Central Asia for our craft producers. This is a big step to be visible online. Unfortunately, for now, all we can sell is craft, some wool carpets, some little things. But with the time, hopefully, with huge market of 16 million loyal customers, we can grow. Amazon opened a huge hub in Kazakhstan, and hopefully we'll be doing a lot of trades with Central Asian countries, and we will be selling our goods out abroad. And we have special trains from Ozon. So hopefully our logistics sector will be covering logistic companies, because a lot of logistic companies which were local starting to sign contracts with Amazon and with Alibaba and with Ozon also. What is really amazing, Kazakhstan became the second place mining place in Kazakhstan after China. As soon as all the miners ran from China because of restrictions, they came to Kazakhstan, and for now we have 17 official farms which mine in Bitcoin. So Kazakhstan accidentally became one of the Bitcoin capital. Even with the low speed of internet, we have a lot of farms all over the country, which doesn't work great with our electrical companies and with our ecology, but our government unfortunately don't care, because with the taxes, they have huge amount of money. And our Ministry of Ecology is trying to protect the states, but unfortunately for now, we are the first, and we will be growing as a blockchain capital and blockchain country. So, as you may see, each year, 42 billion USD going to the gray miners, and our government trying to create new tax policy and to protect the state and protect the economy, as it's very touchy and very sensible for our economy. As most of the companies, even airlines, are trying to switch from the classical financial structure and classical financial contracts through the banks to blockchain, and then it will not be so visible for the state, for the tax system. And hopefully with the new legislation, as now we're creating new law concerning digital trade and concerning mining and national associations, it will be stabilized in next 2-3 years. So thank you. Presentation was very short, but we are trying as Central Asian markets to grow, to be visible, and to create our local space for digital trade and be involved in all the communication between countries. And hopefully with IBF platform, our local producers, our local logistic companies will have possibility to cross the borders to be implemented in the global trade worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. It's amazing what's happening in Kazakhstan. I don't know how comfortable I'll be though, with all my information out there, everything. I wonder how comfortable I'll feel about it, but it is amazing. And I'd also be a little bit concerned about carbon footprint. But anyway, let's wait for the questions when the questions come in. Now for our final speaker. Our final speaker, slightly different now. He's going to talk about something that is part of the new Industry 4.0. He's going to talk to us about drones, and he's going to generally give us an insight because it's a fad and it seems as though in certain parts of the world that it's the thing to do. We all have to get drones. Drones is the way to go about life, and that's going to be the whole way, the way goods are going to be delivered on the last mile. So let's have a listen to Mr. Yaniv. Yaniv is currently in Israel, but otherwise he operates from Africa, from South Africa. And he's going to take you through the development of drones through the years. And of course, he's going to talk to you a little bit about a new hybrid drone that he is working on. So please, over to you, Yaniv, please. If you can share your slides.
Sure. I take slight offense to you calling my industry a fad, but otherwise, let's dive in. That's right, drone logistics, a recent history. So as Reshma said, my name is Yaniv. I'm very, very happy to join you all. I'm not a logistician, but for the last 4 years, I've been working in the drone logistics industry. And I've seen a lot, and I've been part of this recent sort of increase in drone logistics. And so I'm happy to share with you sort of some of what I've seen and share some of the story. I'll keep the presentation short so we have a lot of time for questions. But I just want to give you sort of a retrospective about who's doing what and what we've learned so far. So let's dive in. So for the last 4 years, until the beginning of this year, I actually worked for a company called Zipline. Zipline is the world's biggest drone logistics company, currently operating in Rwanda and in Ghana. Although they've just announced that they will also be working in the US and in Japan in the coming year or two. I'm not sure when that will launch, but what Zipline essentially was able to demonstrate is that by using these drones, which are fully autonomous, they were, and especially in places like Rwanda and Ghana, where they have the unique combination of extreme last mile logistics challenges and pretty lax regulations, just because the airspace is not quite as busy as in some of the places you might be. They were able to demonstrate that they can actually solve the problem. As you can see here, the Zipline aircraft is a fixed wing aircraft, which means it basically looks like a small airplane. And they launch it from a launcher just like this. On the left, you can see a map of Rwanda. And what you can see there is how the 2 Zipline distribution centers essentially cover pretty much the entire population of Rwanda. So this is a map of Rwanda, and essentially they're covering the entire country. And they've pretty much eradicated maternal mortality from postpartum hemorrhaging because they keep the blood at the distribution centers. And when a mother somewhere is suffering from postpartum hemorrhaging, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's pretty straightforward. If she has access to fresh blood that's been in the cold chain, and she has a medicine called Pitocin, she's going to live. And if she doesn't have those 2 things, she's going to bleed to death. That is no longer really a big problem in Rwanda because anybody can have blood in 15, 20 minutes. So this was pretty much the first sort of stake in the ground. It required a lot of regulatory loopholes. In fact, the secret is that the president made this happen by declaring that all the drones belonged to him personally and therefore fell under executive privilege. So all the regulators sort of threw their hands up in the air. But that's the kind of bravery, I think I would call that bravery, that it took to demonstrate that this is a thing that can work. And these aircraft, as you can see, fly very far beyond visual line of sight. So this was a really important demonstration of what this industry can do. Now, some of you might be more familiar with these aircraft. As opposed to the fixed wing aircraft, which is the category that Zipline went to market with, these are what are called multi-rotor or quadcopters, depending on on kind of which part of the industry you're from. But essentially, I think you can, as you look at this, you can see that they take off vertically, what we in the industry call a VTOL aircraft, vertical takeoff and landing. They can go up and down. And the primary differences between them, aside from the obvious, is that this requires no ground infrastructure. Zipline's ground infrastructure costs millions of dollars to set up, whereas this thing can take off from anywhere. The downside, of course, is that this technology is one that uses all of its power to stay up in the air instead of moving forward. So they have similarly very small payloads. The payloads here are between 3 and 5 kilograms compared to Zipline at about 1.5 kilograms, similarly small, but the range is much smaller. These guys can go maybe 10 kilometers away, whereas Zipline, as I said, can go up to 85 kilometers away. The other benefit of a system like this is that because it lands at the destination, a system like this can also pick something up and take it back, reverse logistics. And when you're interested in health logistics like I am, that's very exciting because you're trying to, especially now in the time of COVID, if you're trying to figure out if people in the farther regions are getting infected, you want to be able to test them, but you can't test them without building labs everywhere. And so a system that allows reverse logistics allows you to bring samples back to a lab. Now, what's interesting is that these two different technologies have sort of come to head with Walmart in the US. Walmart last year, in the same week, announced a partnership with Flytrex, this Israeli company that is on the left, and also with Zipline. And it was an interesting question that the whole industry was watching. What's going to happen? Who's going to win? Which of these fundamentally different platforms is more appropriate for home delivery by drone? And what we've seen is pretty interesting. You see the Zipline system, you just go back to that slide. As you can see, it's a fixed wing aircraft, and that means that it can't land at the destination. So they drop things with a parachute. So hopefully they get it close enough to your house or within your yard, hopefully. That's very sophisticated technology that Zipline's developed to drop the parachute perfectly so that the wind will carry it right to the destination. It works very well. Not quite as accurate as these guys who are literally landing in your backyard, or they can hover over your backyard and lower it with a winch. So when Walmart gave both of these companies opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities, something interesting happened. Zipline's facility has been constructed for over a year now, and they have not done any flights while they're still waiting for regulatory approval. While for whatever reason, the regulators were much more comfortable with this aircraft that you see on the left, and they've allowed this company, Flytrex, to launch a complete home delivery service from 2 Walmarts. And it's been so successful that while Zipline hasn't actually done a single flight, these guys at Flytrex have now gotten a contract where they're allowed to expand to every Walmart in America as fast as they can make drones. So that's very exciting, especially if you consider that Zipline has raised about $550 million, and these guys at Flytrex, I think, have raised something to the tune of $20 or $30 million. So we've learned a lot in the industry about where these different platforms are useful, and of course the downside of the system is the range. But as the head of innovation at Tesco told me, Tesco in the UK signed the exact same deal with this company Mana, the one on the right. It's an Irish startup that is very similar to Flytrex, in fact, in capabilities and an approach to the problem. As the head of Tesco told me, if you only have a 10-kilometer range from every Tesco in the UK, you're pretty much covering 95% of the population of the UK. So what we've learned is that the hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone into developing the Zipline system, which is really optimized for speed and for distance, actually aren't that useful when it comes to something like home delivery, because people don't need their groceries or their e-commerce products that fast. And the drones don't really need to travel that far because they have so many of these logistics hubs. So I think hopefully you're getting a sense of some of the pros and cons of these two platforms. Then these two platforms made a baby called the hybrid. So this is what we call in the industry a hybrid drone. It's a fixed wing aircraft, so it has the benefits of Zipline, that it can go really fast, really far in pretty much any weather. But it has these propellers that go up and that will allow it to take off vertically or land vertically. And they had kind of had the best of both worlds. As somebody who's looked at a lot of these different systems, I really think that this is an amazing innovation. And you can see that these are the two major companies that are entering the space. The one on the left is Swoop from Australia. They've actually been more active than Zipline in Africa. They're in more countries and they're doing more flights, but they don't have such a great PR team. So you might not have heard of them, while some of you have probably heard of Zipline. The one on the right is called Wingcopter. That's a German company. And while they both have a similar approach in terms of the platform, in terms of the fundamentals of how this should be done, they've actually taken a different approach, where the one on the left has decided to make it as cheap as possible, because they are very clearly oriented towards solving a health logistics problem in Africa and in Asia, where they operate, averaging about $8 a flight, compared to Zipline, who are somewhere around $65 a flight for a similar payload. The one on the right, Wingcopter, you may have seen them in the news because they've partnered with companies like DHL, like Mercedes. They've signed a lot of partnerships, but it's a much more sophisticated aircraft, where those propellers can actually turn on a rotor and move forward to go forward, or up and down if you're taking off and landing. So it's a more sophisticated system. You can also see that they have the capability of dropping 3 separate payloads, whereas the one on the left is just designed to land and allow you to take off a single payload. So it really comes down to the industry sort of bifurcating into the places where it's all about solving a problem as cheaply as possible, versus developing something that's versatile and fancy and can do all kinds of things. So this has been the state of the industry until now. When I left, sorry, Reshma, can I just have a quick time check? I'm not sure if I need to wrap up.
I was actually going to ask you if you could please quickly wrap up, because
Sure.
Very little time for Q&A. Thanks.
No problem. No problem. Yeah, so I'll just do one more minute. So when I left Zipline, it was really with all of this information that I've just shared with you, and I felt like there might even be a better solution. And the company that I joined is a company based in South Africa that makes this airship. And it's African engineering. It's the first African entrant into the UAV space. And the airship has a lot of interesting capabilities that none of these other aircraft have. As you can see, it's full of helium. It's completely autonomous, so it flies all by itself. There's no pilot required. And from a regulatory perspective, it's wonderful, because it essentially can't crash, even if there's worst case scenario, let's say a power failure. It simply floats in the air, and we can go get it. Even if someone was to shoot a bullet through it, the helium is not under pressure, and therefore it would still lose its lift over a few days. We have plenty of time to take it to safety. So this is a system that I'm very excited about, also because the helium is doing all the lifting work. It can carry 50 kilograms, and it can travel 250 kilometers on a single charge. If you want to see these systems side by side, you can see them right here. You see, obviously, the payload is much greater, flight range is much greater. There's no ground infrastructure required, just like the hybrid systems. And it's much cheaper to operate, because essentially it's a big balloon. You don't have all of the sophisticated, expensive hardware inside that is necessary for the kind of operations that the other platforms use. We also have the unique ability to hover in perpetuity. So the aircraft can stay in the sky for weeks if it needs to, using solar power to maintain its position. And these are the core use cases that we've really decided to focus on with this new aircraft. Since you're in the logistics space, I'll just finish with this final slide. The most interesting capability, which is the reason that UNICEF has recently signed an agreement with us, and so has the Red Cross in the Philippines, UNICEF in Namibia and Red Cross in the Philippines, is that this is the first aircraft that can actually do a milk run route. So the aircraft can travel between facilities, dropping things off and picking things up as necessary. So I'm sorry for going over a little bit, but let me stop there, and I look forward to questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Yaniv. That nice looking Zeppelin you're showing us right there, your airship. Thanks very much for giving us an insight on drones and how the different types of drones and the new hybrids, as well as what Cloudline has. Thank you very much. So we're running in fact, I think we only have 2 minutes left. And if it's possible, I know there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. There are loads of questions. So I'm going to ask the panel speakers to try and answer them by yourselves, but I'll take 1 or 2 for each speaker. So I'll start with Ian. Ian, you have actually so many questions. So I'm going to pick one question. Well, I'm going to pick a question that will be tied to two of these questions. One of these questions is from Kim Hassel, and the other one is from Kelroy James. So Kim wants to know how far have they gone in terms of the freight industry. So if you can give a really quick answer. And wouldn't blockchain address a lot of these standards? That is the other question. So do you think you can give us a quick answer on that, Ian?
Yes, the first question, IATA has done a lot of work in the air and got well ahead of that in that space. CEFACT has been more in the ocean and canal and all the other bits and pieces, but there's now joint work going on because obviously there's a relationship with that. In this project that I talked about, the multimodal transport, there's people from that kind of world working with the people with CEFACT on that. So there'll be some alignment, which is what's necessary. On the other bit, blockchain, there's been a lot of work done on blockchain, and I think where it was maybe seen as a penicillin for all problems, we're probably determining that in many respects it isn't. There's a lot of technologies out there that do just as well or maybe better. But regardless of that, you've still got to understand the semantics. The data's got to be meaningful to and the same for the persons at each end, no matter where they are in the world. So blockchain's an excellent technology. And like, as with all technology, it's all great, but unless the basic understanding around the semantics of the data and the process are there, and that's really what CEFACT is looking at, these technologies don't really, it's a combination of the two that produces a really good result, put it that way.
Okay, so they work together.
They work together, and on the references to CEFACT, there's a lot of papers, white papers and others, and still coming out on blockchain application, use cases and so forth. So there's material in there that people can look at.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ian. Now we'll take a question for Mr. Romesh. And Mr. Romesh, this question is actually by Mark Delanet. And he wanted to know, because, you know, when the COVID hit us, we pretty much had only a couple of weeks to get in and get on board in terms of, you know, going digital and all that. He wanted to know, was there any process open to error or incorrect or potential illegal activity when, you know, this switch in your experience? Did you have anything of that sort of issues to deal with?
That not really, because that is the type of pushback that was used by various stakeholders who didn't want it to happen. But in any event, these are all, you know, if you look at the delivery order transmission, the release, the delivery advice release, these are all EDIFACT standard messaging that existed anyway. And the fact was that they were not used for administrative reasons. So it was a question of flipping the switch. The security is already built in, the host-to-host connectivity is already there, shipping lines and terminals are using the same things all over the world. It was just a case of implementing here. Getting people used to it, you know, the uninitiated used to it, the customer used to it was a little more difficult. And that's where the hand-holding took place. And that also could be done remotely because of the type of technology. I mean, the simple stuff that we have available with short videos and short messaging services and so on. So yes, there is I mean, the short answer is it's not an insurmountable problem. It is a problem that is most often blown up out of proportion by those who would rather the system didn't change.
Thank you so much. It's actually normal teething problems, right?
Yeah.
Which we have to go through. Exactly. Thank you so much. Marina, now there's a question for you, Marina. And this question is again from Mark, and Mark would like to know, I mean, he was really impressed with your presentation, especially with Kaspi Bank. Even I was dominating. He would like to know, is there a fear that Kaspi Bank can begin to start increasing or developing new charges to customers, you know, seeing as they monopolize the whole thing?
Not for now. What is really strange, I mean, for example, when you do financial transaction inside Kaspi Bank, there is no charges at all. But when you're trying to pay outside, then there is a charge, but it's not so high. That's why so many people are attracted to Kaspi. So to be honest, it's like money flow between one bank. If you're paying for bread, it's still the money and payment are still inside the bank, because the store which selling the bread is the Kaspi Bank customer. So that's why there is two systems, like for corporations, like state budget, and for privately owned sectors is Kaspi Bank, which for me, because I'm economist, this is really strange, and it's a little bit tricky and maybe risky for the future, because all the money and all the payments are consolidated in one bank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the fear, right? Get the critical mass in and then come up with something that would probably not be very comfortable for everybody.
Yeah, but for the customers, it's really easy. You have QR code on your mobile. You just go in with your mobile and you're paying for everything, for the fuel to the taxes. So it's easy.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And finally, one last question. And actually, this question didn't come into the Q&A box. It was in a chat box, actually. And this is for Yaniv. Yaniv, this is about Zipline's launch in Rwanda. Apparently, Mr. Okowu, I believe, asked this question. He said, happy for this presentation on Zipline launch in Rwanda. The question is, what makes it sustainable in Rwanda, yet neighboring countries like Uganda up its use? So I guess he wants to know how sustainable is Zipline, but I believe you already answered that in your presentation, but maybe you'd want to give us a quick answer here.
Well, if by sustainable, we're talking about environmentally sustainable, all of these systems are electric. But the more interesting question is financially sustainable, and Zipline is not. Rwanda does not pay, I mean, they pay something symbolic, but it was really just about demonstrating that this thing can work. And that's how innovation is supposed to work. It can be expensive at first, then you make it cheaper over time. Zipline, unfortunately, has decided to actually just go to other markets where you can pay more, like the US and Japan. Whereas companies like our company, which is based in Africa, and Swoop, have really decided to try to bring the technology, not only make it safer and have better specs, but also be much more affordable. Ghana is the biggest implementation in the world, and with 600 flights a day across 4 distribution centers. And you might have seen a lot of what they're doing with the vaccine distribution in the press. They're paying for 1/3 of it. But the other 2/3 are coming from donors. So no, Zipline is not a sustainable solution, but you know, they get a lot of credit for having demonstrated what's possible and opening up the market for so many entrants that can now come in and compete.
Thank you very much, Yaniv. So anyways, you've put your information in the chat box, and if anyone wants to get in touch with you, they can go ahead and get in touch with you. Thank you so very much, our panel speakers. We've actually exceeded our time, and I am so glad to see our international president patient enough, waiting for us to pass the mic to our good man. Dear Dato' Razak, sir, thank you so much for everything that you have done for our institution, sir. Sir, the mic is yours. This was your idea. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rashma. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening, everywhere, wherever you are. This event gives us an opportunity to meet, though in virtual, but very meaningful, since face-to-face still not possible. I'm delighted to see all of you in excellent condition, surviving from the deadly virus. Let's pray for safety and health together. I'm honored to be invited to give a closing remark at this auspicious event of yours today. As you all know, last year has been a difficult time for many in CILT, and we are focused on providing and sharing solutions to some of the biggest issues of our time. The safe and efficient transfer of goods and medicines, the safe and effective passage of people through multiple modes of transport, and the policy and planning that enables the world to create the transport infrastructures in a sustainable manner for the future world. In 2020, we began our focus on the new challenges to our profession and our world as we announced the 5 focus areas. As for my presidency, in 2021, we have a special focus on sustainability and digitalization. Today, we presented and deliberated the big picture on how digitalization supports trade collaboration, This will provide an understanding of the global trade digitalization landscape and consider the benefit of digitalization in facilitating collaboration and networking cross borders. Congratulations to all speakers and presenters, as well as your active participation, respond with outstanding questions and great comments. Nothing more could I add or subtract from what was said by the experts. High level of presentation reflects the experience each individual had gone through. To me, it's a mind-blowing when I see the IBF is just a 3-word stuff, but going into it in micro, there are so much things to do, to observe, to communicate, to watch, to listen, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of work for Finbar, Clary, and his team. Now, ladies and gentlemen, from my perspective, about 2 weeks after Central Asia Trade Forum 2021, a major power disruption in China caused a breakdown in supply chain. Producing to meet the anticipated year-end seasonal sales peak drove excessive demand for electricity. The global supply chain and associated logistics behind it may be invincible, but it's important in bringing about that which we take for granted cannot be overstated. About 1 month after Central Asia Trade Forum 2021, CATF 2021, the United Nations held COP26 over the urgency of climate change, UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties. Now, as the string that ties various components of the global supply chain together, the logistic industry can play a very impactful role. While we are strategists and planners, we are also the realists on the ground, so we should answer the question of implementation. What are the sweet spots of digitalization of logistics and supply chain? The sweet spot means where the advantages and also the pitfalls lies. Among others are, firstly, the world has about 8 billion people, 4 times more than it can optimally support. The weight of feeding and nurturing 8 billion people through inefficient production, supply chains, and logistics can no longer be burdened upon our planet. If we do not stop the global temperature from rising any further, mankind faces the threat of mass extinction by 2100. This may be mankind's final century on Earth. Secondly, the logistics community should hold continuous discussion, not only amongst each other, but with bankers, lawyers, government bodies, scientists, economists, as we navigate our way through these uncharted waters. We need to understand what is happening, what will happen, what we can do, what we need, which cannot be sacrificed constantly and continuously. Thirdly, we need to ensure that the logistic industry play a crucial part every day, everywhere in protecting our climate, ensuring social justice, ensuring access to food, medication, needs to all who need them at a price they can afford. We need to overcome inefficiency and ineffectiveness. We have no room to spare for these. Fourthly, to do this, we need to enlist experienced project managers and digitalization experts, solution architects, artificial intelligence experts, industry 4.0 experts who understand supply chain, understand the logistics industry, understand the socio-economic balance, the science behind our environment to be part of our team. Fifth, last but not least, we must be willing to reinvest our profits to modernize our operation to save the earth, or nothing else matters. With that, I would like to conclude my sum up and to congratulate our moderator, Reshma, speakers, participants, Finbar and IBF team, and CILT international staff for their effort in making today's event a memorable and an interesting one. Now, lest we forget, We have to protect and stand for what we are in CILT as a family and as a profession, and ensure no one or nothing threatens that without us responding very strongly. Our strength is in our family, stronger together. Stay safe. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Over to you, Resma.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. It's such a nice summation you have given us. And, you know, Dato Razak, for those of you who don't know, who are not from our CILT family, like Yanev and Ian, he has been championing inclusiveness, pushing the women's agenda, helping the planet, and pushing digitalization in a sustainable manner. So thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much our esteemed panel speakers and CILT International, as well as Mr. Finba and Haji Abi for having me as your host and moderator for today's event. Thank you very much. Have a great day and a great week ahead. Bye-bye, everyone.